It's time for you and me to stand up for ourselves.
It takes money to kill bad guys.
Welcome to Unwashed and Unruly, where we're never neutral, just accurate. Today we're talking about why Iran needs nukes and why it should win against the sadists, sociopaths of the US and Israel. I'm your host, Lola Michaels, joined by the mad historian, Ezra Said.
Hey, Lola. Hi, everybody.
Our vibes regulator, Cam Cruz.
What's up, guys?
And today we're joined by our friend, Armand Peruzi, a Marxist and earth scientist who knows a lot more than we do. Thank you for joining us, Armand.
I'm humbled and great to be here joining this wonderful podcasters.
And if you haven't listened to any of our previous 18 episodes, go ahead and find one that interests you, then hit that follow button and leave a comment. If you have a question or something to share, you can also email us at contact@unwashedunruly.com. The war against Iran was never about preventing a nuclear threat. It was about crushing a country that refused to kneel completely to US and Israeli interests. Washington and Tel Aviv are the aggressors, threatening nuclear Armageddon while carrying out another cynical regime change. Iran has shown tremendous restraint after decades of provocation and murderous sanctions. If Iran has the upper hand in this war, we think that's good. The bourgeois media lies about a fanatic enemy in Tehran, but who is really buying it? The true nuclear crazies are steering the American war machine, the most murderous and destructive force on the planet. After the 1991-92 collapse of the Soviet Union got rid of the main counterweight to US hegemony, possessing nukes has become the only way a country can protect its own sovereignty. The consequences of this unprovoked war are huge. We first saw the Tomahawk missile strike on an Iranian girls' school, killing at least 175 people. Masses of civilians slaughtered, cities carpet-bombed, infrastructure destroyed. In Lebanon, Israel has killed thousands, displaced over 1 million, which is around 20% of the population. And with Iran sitting on 10% of the world's oil reserves, everyone knows this war is going to blow up the entire global economy, sending prices for gas, food, fertilizer, and everything else through the roof, hitting every single one of us where it hurts. This nightmare could cost hundreds of billions of dollars, and the people paying the bill aren't the billionaires or the politicians. It's everyday working people here and across the globe. If you haven't guessed already, in today's episode, we'll be discussing how the real enemies are the tyrants and madmen who run this system. The fight for Iran's survival and for the future of humanity means a defeat for US imperialism and the Zionist state. Let's get this off the agenda. For decades, Iran's nuclear program has been framed as some kind of near imminent threat, and the Iranian regime has consistently said its enrichment efforts are not aimed at building a bomb. The International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, reported no credible evidence of an active weapons program. So what's really behind the imperialist lies here? I want to make it clear that this isn't just Trump. The Democrats and the Republicans might disagree on the means, but the end goal is the same, which is total supremacy in the oil-rich region. Both parties are hawkish on this. And basically, since the aftermath of the 1979 Islamic Revolution, they've carried out another kind of warfare against Iran. That's economic warfare in the way of crippling sanctions. The sanctions date back to Jimmy Carter, and they've cost hundreds of billions of dollars, starved and destroyed industry, medicine. So if we know that the claim about nuclear weapons is a smokescreen here, kind of a blueprint to destroy Iran, we know that Israel, the ruthless Zionist state, with the goal of completely annihilating the Palestinian people, they're the only nuclear armed state in the region. Meanwhile, the US rulers have enough nuclear firepower to destroy humanity many times over, and they're the ones who have used nuclear weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. So I would actually argue that Iran needs nukes as a deterrent in this case. What do you guys think?
Historically, revolutionary Marxists have taken the position that Iran has the right to nuclear weapons and the necessary means of transporting the nuclear warhead in an effort to secure its sovereignty. So the political question here is that nuclear weapons are essential to ensure the country's sovereignty against hostile imperialist powers that historically have ruled over your land. So the struggle against the imperialist rule is just as old as the imperialist rule itself. It goes back to the history of Britain ruling over Iran, and prior to that was to the north, it was Tsar's army that occupied the Iranian north, and then the British occupied the south. And prior to that, it was the Portuguese that controlled the Gulf about 400 years ago. So the imperialist rule and subjugation has 400 years old history, and resistance to that also goes to 400 years. So to answer your question, now there are voices from inside of Iran in regards to the sanctions. They point out that Iran has become self-sufficient, and they've had their own industrial revolution in terms of missiles technology, drone technology. They've made significant advances despite the sanctions. So that is the crux that has created these conditions where people have to take sides. And this is one of those questions that how you reply to it shows whose side you're on. And I actually posed this question to several groups of Iranians in diaspora. The first group laughed at it. So these people obviously do not understand the sentiments of Iranians for independence. They see imperialism as superior and Islamic regime as like this heinous thing, the most heinous thing on earth. Their attitude is almost pathological to the point of going and asking for the country to be bombed.
And if I could just ask
Yeah.
Arman, are these people you're talking about, are they young people who grew up in the US? Are they people who moved from Iran as like older people? Like what is their
All of the
generational?
above. All of the above. So, for example, one of my close relatives, who's a recent immigrant, she has the same position, as if like they speak the same language politically. Like they all said, well, the worst thing that can happen in this war is the Islamic regime stays in power. That's the worst thing for them.
Wow.
Right? And then I posed it to another group of people, one who is more of a Iranian and has a more of a historical viewpoint. She was like, hell yeah, they need nuclear weapons because it's a matter of sovereignty. So this war has polarized everybody. This other woman was telling me that they had a gathering of 40 Iranian women, and after a half hour, the whole thing broke into a huge brawl between the monarchy supporters, and they had to actually like physically intervene and separate them from like a fist
Oh
fight.
my gosh.
We can talk a little bit more about the monarchists and like where they come from and stuff, but I'm curious to get Ezra's take also on this.
Well, I think I would begin with a quote from the Bolshevik leader Lenin at the beginning of the First World War, where he wrote, "If tomorrow Morocco were to declare war on France, India on England, Persia or China on Russia, and so forth, those would be just defensive wars, irrespective of who attacked first. And every socialist would sympathize with the victory of the oppressed, dependent, unequal states against the oppressing, slave-owning, predatory great powers." And I think that for anybody who styles themselves as an opponent of American imperialism, that has to be the starting point. So, as you pointed out, Lola, the collapse of the USSR through capitalist restoration has really meant that the only thing left for sovereignty is nuclear weapons. When Gaddafi gave up his nuclear weapons program, he ended up with a bayonet up his ass, quite literally. Saddam Hussein and Iraq were invaded and overthrown precisely because they didn't have weapons of mass destruction. But nobody fucks with North Korea because
But
they have nuclear weapons. This is, to me, not only a polemic against the United States and the Western imperialist powers, but also the Iranian government. If Iran wants to sustain its sovereignty, it needs nuclear weapons so that this insanity can stop. And they say they're not developing nuclear weapons. I think I believe them because they haven't for more than 20 years. If there's one thing that comes out of the assassination of Khamenei, who issued that fatwa against the development of nuclear weapons, it's that I hope the fatwa has died with him, because Iran needs nukes. Not to attack anybody, but to simply maintain its sovereignty against both the Americans and the sociopath who run the state of Israel.
I wanted to listen to some of the smokescreen, the pretext for this war. And the first clip that we have is Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And this was him addressing the press. This is on February 25th. So it was a couple days before the US and Israel launched this year's attack. And so a reporter basically asks, what do you expect in terms of negotiations, right? Because we're told that it was Iran, not the US, that was negotiating in bad faith. And you'll see basically that it's full of contradictions, what he says. Like, Iran's program was obliterated, but they're close to bombing us. And, kind of like they said, Iran was a week away from attacking the US, like for the last 20 years.
They've been saying that. Yeah, exactly.
So let's just take a listen and then we can comment.
But I want you to understand, and everyone should know, that Iran poses a very grave threat to the United States and has for a very long time. They are in possession, first and foremost, after their nuclear program was obliterated, they were told not to try to restart it. And here they are. You can see them always trying to rebuild elements of it. They're not enriching right now, but they're trying to get to the point where they ultimately can. The other thing I would point you to, however, is that Iran possesses a very large number of ballistic missiles, particularly short-range ballistic missiles that threaten the United States and our bases in the region and our partners in the region. And all of our bases in the UAE, in Qatar, in Bahrain. And they also possess naval assets that threaten shipping and try to threaten the U.S. Navy. So I want everybody to understand that beyond just the nuclear program, they possess these conventional weapons that are solely designed to attack America and attack Americans if they so choose to do so. These things have to be addressed.
You like that he missed his talking point there? He was like, they're developing nuclear weapons. I mean, we destroyed it. We destroyed
What an ass.
Keeping up with Trump's pronouncements is a very difficult job.
That's very true.
It's notable that basically what they're talking about is disarmament. To disarm Iran, make it defenseless.
But the problem is that Iran moved its country toward U.S. military bases.
I was actually confused about that. Like when he was saying that they were built specifically to target America, I'm like, we built all these bases like around them. What is he talking about?
He's not completely wrong. Here's what I mean by that. The U.S. built all these bases. The Sunni Arab Gulf regimes, who are ashamed to the human race, allowed their countries to house all these bases. And Iran knew what that meant. And so they developed a missile program to do what you were seeing them doing. But it's a purely defensive missile program.
It's really interesting, too, that all of these countries cozy it up to the U.S. under the idea that the U.S. is going to protect them. And now having the bases just has made them targets and done the exact opposite of what the intention was.
These things would make sense if we make some historical connections. For example, during the Iran-Iraq War, Iraqis had these Soviet-made missiles. These were like huge missiles with no guiding systems. So they would just fire this up. This is before the age of digital technology. Everything was analog, not precise. And the Iraqis used it against Iran. So the missile technology has evolved. Iranians have had good 20 years. Once they realized that they'll be attacked, that was just about 20 years ago, post-Iraq invasion, that it was made clear that they'd be the next target. So the Iranians have had more than 20 years of developing this missile technology in a digital age where some of the intelligence is fed to them by the Chinese or the Russians. They've taken all of the radar installations. And so that's a reference to these bases that Americans have built in the past 20 years.
Going back to how we kicked off the episode, talking about the nuclear program, where it usually gets talked about only in terms of weapons. But as you pointed out, the nuclear program is completely tied up with national identity and pride, building scientific and technological capacity. There's an element of proof that a country can have this kind of technology despite sanctions, despite isolation. And the scientists, the nuclear scientists who have been targeted and assassinated, they're on the front lines of this in terms of promoting self-sufficiency. And then there's the other question of what nuclear tech is used for, which is like mapping underground resources, finding oil, gas, and mineral deposits. And then in terms of nuclear power, stabilizing electricity, reducing reliance on fossil fuels. So I just think some of that stuff is really important to know about in terms of what this nuclear program is really about, what it means not only politically and historically, but practically.
They've had developed nuclear technology in medicine where you send these isotopes to have an internal view of various organs. So this nuclear technology in medicine is quite advanced in Iran. Then there is the nuclear power plant in Bushehr, which ironically Americans sort of initiated it to build this nuclear technology. Well, back then,
I think, is this a part of the Atoms for Peace project? I think that they reached out to Iran for that, right?
Yeah, the Atoms for Peace. And now all of that is out the door because it really lost its whole historical context after the collapse of Soviet Union. None of these things really matter because the imperialists now, they had a free hand in doing whatever. There was like no fear of military or political retaliation by the Soviets. So it's a whole different period where the right of sovereignty is closely tied to your right to develop these technologies and ensuring the military means to be a sovereign nation in the face of imperialist domination, both presently and historically. So Iranians have proved that they can defend themselves effectively. And that's a win for the oppressed all over the world.
Just a point of caution. I mean, the war is not over. Let me start by saying big ass hats off to Iran. They are facing the world's most powerful military and its rabid dog, the USS Israel aircraft carrier. They are facing a bunch of demented, pusillanimous, despicable Arab regimes in the Persian Gulf. And they have not only held their own, there's a quality where you watch them and they're playing three-dimensional chess while the Trump administration is just learning to play chutes and ladders, So big ass hats off.
Yeah.
Having said that, I find it very hard to imagine the US winning this war, but I also find it very hard to imagine the US just saying, we lost the war.
Right.
And that's where the danger lies. You're talking about two nuclear armed powers. I can imagine in particular that the Tel Aviv regime is telephoning the Washington regime on a daily basis saying, can we just drop a tactical nuclear strike and take care of this?
Yep.
Or the US might come up with it on their own. The American military is very powerful. What it really comes down to in the end is a question of how much is the US willing to take in terms of losses and in terms of the destruction of the world economy and the American economy in turn. So we will see. But having said all that, goddamn Iran, they have shown that these beasts are not invincible and can be stopped.
I think that also points to the extent that there have been some quote unquote divisions in the administration about this war, that a lot of it is about whether or not they actually thought they could win, right?
Nothing succeeds like success. And they were really, really ecstatic after their operational success in Venezuela. And I believe they thought that if they murder the 86-year-old man with cancer and a few other leading...
That's Khamenei, by the way.
That's Khamenei, yes. Who, by the way, clearly sacrificed himself as a martyr because everybody knew he was the next target. And it's very funny reading all these articles about all the massive intelligence to track him down. The guy was in his house. Anyway, I believe they believed that they would have a Venezuela operation where if they would assassinate or cut off the head, they could either replace it with somebody they like or find somebody they like or somebody who's willing to work with them. What they miscalculated on, which I cannot believe that American intelligence doesn't know this, was Iran is not Venezuela. It is not cursed by being in the Western Hemisphere, in the same hemisphere as the US. They have been preparing for this for forever. To be perfectly fair, the Iranians, before the war started, said exactly what they were going to do in response to the war and have carried it out to the T. So if,
Yeah,
you know,
it has not been a mystery. Yeah.
I remember Trump saying everybody was surprised. Well, all you had to do was listen to what the Iranians said they were going to do.
Well, you saw those fissures in U.S. intelligence when they questioned Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard in those hearings, the worldwide threats hearing. And Senator John Ossoff says, what is your take on Iran being an imminent nuclear threat? And she basically gives up the game here because she tries completely to distance herself from the administration.
Was it the assessment of the intelligence community that there was an imminent nuclear threat posed by the Iranian regime?
The intelligence community assessed that Iran maintained the intention to rebuild and to continue to grow their nuclear enrichment capability.
Was it the assessment of the intelligence community that there was a, quote, imminent nuclear threat posed by the Iranian regime, yes or no?
Senator, the only person who can determine what is and is not an imminent threat is the president.
False. This is the worldwide threats hearing where you present to Congress national intelligence, timely, objective, and independent of political considerations. You've stated today that the intelligence community's assessment is that Iran's nuclear enrichment program was obliterated and that, quote, there had been no efforts since then to try to rebuild their enrichment capability. Was it the intelligence community's assessment that nevertheless, despite this obliteration, there was a, quote, imminent nuclear threat posed by the Iranian regime? Yes or no?
It is not the intelligence community's responsibility to determine what is and is not an imminent threat.
I just want to say for the record that I hate the term intelligence community.
Well, politically speaking, that just shows that they just had no strategic plan other than thinking that they're going to have a regime change. You know, they probably listened to some bozo from Beverly Hills who convinced them that the average Iranian wants to overthrow the regime. Once you go in there and take out Khamenei, then people will rise up. And
It's really wild, too, to think that America is going to come in and liberate people when we look at the last, 30 or 40 years of regime change in the Middle East, where things just get worse after we leave and totally destroy everything.
So that we have a little bit of a background on the Iranian expat population, these reactionary monarchists who want to be BFFs with the West. We had to subject Ezra to looking for a clip. I mean, I wasn't going to send Ezra out to these pro-monarchist protests.
No, you stay away.
If he were a decent reporter, no, I'm just kidding. But he did find a clip of a gray zone reporter talking to some of the folks at a rally full of monarchist U.S. and Israeli flags.
Well, if you don't mind, since I have to go through this torture, I actually want to play both clips. So the first clip is actually not the protesters. It's the king in waiting, Reza Pahlavi. It's some kind of Fox News interview. Begins by thanking the U.S. for murdering Iranian people. So we'll start with that one.
Well, first of all, it's so good to be back with you on the program. I would like to first say that I join millions of my compatriots at home and abroad who thank President Trump for this much-needed intervention that brings us so much closer than ever to final victory and liberation.
There was that school in Iran that was bombed, 150 dead. But you see this all as worth it. I mean, you think we should go to the end?
Yes, it's worth it, and that's why we are here. We are gonna protest. Even if it was not an Islamic regime missile, it was worth it. Very, very worth it.
You would support Donald Trump, for example, sending troops or sending more airstrikes to Iran?
Yeah, whatever Trump is doing, it is helping us, of course, 100%.
There was also a report today that he was considering sending troops to Iran, and you would support that?
Yes, I would support that, yes, because I believe he's doing the right thing.
Donald Trump has been looking at more options, airstrikes, but also sending troops to Iran. Would you guys be supporting that?
Yes, we will.
He's considering sending troops in as well. Is that something you'd support?
Actually, that's what we want.
Yeah. And I also see a lot of Israeli flags here. I mean, this is also to protect Israel from Iran as well, yes?
Exactly.
Thank you to President Trump and Netanyahu for standing with people.
If you had Donald Trump's ear right now, you were in the Oval Office, private room, what would you tell him to do?
Please, please finish the job. Just finish it, whatever it takes. Honestly, I haven't been back to my country over 20 years. I'm not planning to go back. This is my country now. America is my country. And I know this is the best for Americans and for Iranians in Iran.
You're not planning on going back to?
No.
I mean, it takes a special kind of sociopathic creep to thank a foreign country for killing their countrymen, but, you know, that is the Iranian monarchist.
These are the type of things that I hear normally, not from online. And these are the type of things that I have to fight against. The pathological anti-Islam obsession to equate it with fascism is truly sickening. It has blinded these people to the atrocities committed by the imperialists, by the Zionist regime. They see those as justified in being anti-Islam. So anti-Islam in their minds is the ultimate thing, that Islam is more dangerous than all of these other things combined. These things are delusional. So none of it is actually true. It disregards a lot of factual things like the right of Iran to self-defense. Another important part is the self-loathing, that they see imperialists as superior to their backwardness.
It's their economic interest too, isn't it?
And it's their economic interest, but not for all of them. And most of them are parasites anyways. And it is a whole spectrum. There's like the academicians, and they're on side of Trump. So for them, they don't have an economical gain, but then they come and say, the more laws, they've destroyed Iran, they're against science, and I have more scientific freedom here, and therefore I'm on side of Trump.
Which is crazy because Trump in no way supports science.
Exactly.
I don't know, man. Those rockets landing where they're supposed to land is a pretty good indication of really good science.
Yeah, it looked like good science
They
to
have
me.
a lot of good scientists, exactly.
The U.S. likes to go on and on about how these people are run by a bunch of crazy Islamic fanatics and all that stuff, with leaving aside that the U.S. and Israel have a lot of crazy Christian and Jewish fanatics.
Theocratic regimes.
Yeah, in the government. In Iran, more than 50% of all university students are women. And Iran is one of the leading countries, if not the leading country in the world, of having women in STEM. Remember, we're in the US, where Obama's former economic advisor, Larry Summers, and the former head of Harvard University was going around just 15, 20 years ago saying there aren't enough women in STEM because women's brains don't allow for that. Meanwhile, in Iran, that's where you're going to find women in STEM.
I was going to just point out that Larry Summers is also in the Epstein files.
Yeah, I mean, what they're pointing to is that supposedly under the Shah, women were more free. Now, if you're part of a thin elite of middle-class urban women, that's probably true. However, for the vast majority of women in Iran under the Shah before the 1979 revolution, they were covered, barefoot, pregnant, stuck in the villages, and illiterate. So here's the statistic. In the mid-1970s, approximately 30% of Iranian women were literate. Today, since 1979, that number stands at over 90%. And when you look at women in the ages of 18 to 25, it's 99 point something percent. In other words, they have conquered illiteracy. And, I mean, are women oppressed in Iran? Of course they are. But it's a contradictory situation. This is not like Saudi Arabia. Yes. This is not a place where women need permission to go to school or to drive, or this is not like Afghanistan and the Taliban. This is a fairly intelligent government in terms of how they've managed to organize the society in such a way where they can maintain a popular base. Second of all, it really takes to use Armand's words, pathological sort of animal to look at your country and say, bomb it.
Yeah.
The task of any class-conscious worker in Iran is to make sure their guns are aimed at the foreign invaders right now, to defend their sovereignty and their country from the Americans and the Israelis. That is the first duty of every class-conscious worker, not only in Iran, but throughout the world. And these people are the enemies, not only of the Iranian masses, but also of the American and international working class and oppressed, because they want to strengthen the hand of the most oppressive, degenerate, disgusting ruling class on the planet.
Since you mentioned the question of the Shah and the installation of the Shah, let's take a little detour into that question. This hit job that was orchestrated by the CIA and British intelligence when Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh basically decided that Iranian oil profits should actually benefit Iranians instead of padding the pockets of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which is now known as British Petroleum. And the West responded with a coup, and they installed the Shah, and that puppet regime spent 25 years running a blood-drenched regime enforced by the Savak. Is that what it was called? The secret police?
Right.
Yeah, and that still really permeates and haunts the Iranian psyche. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about Mossadegh and some of that and why it was such a direct ancestor to the 1979 Islamic Revolution.
Well, before Mossadegh, the imperialists, the British particularly, they had installed Shah's father, Reza Shah, as their puppet regime that came to power in a coup against the democracy movement. The root of the meddling goes back to actually 1917 and 18, where there was a coup by Reza Shah that overthrew the parliament. The British came in and stopped that whole impetus for a bourgeois democratic revolution in Iran to ensure that the British Anglo-Iranian Oil Company has access to all Iranian oil. So the struggle for independence goes back to 1917, all the way to 1953, where it was in the context of the Cold War, in the context of primarily Americans spearheading political and military attack against the Soviet Union, and Iran having the longest border within the Soviet Union was directly impacted by the existence of the Soviet Union in terms of the upsurge of nationalist movement. So these bourgeois nationalists, Mossadegh himself, he was a descendant of the last dynasty. Qajar, he was like one of the aristocrats. He was a landowner. He was the leader of the National Front, a front of bourgeoisie, whatever bourgeoisie it was, which was mostly merchant, not even financial or industrial. So they came from a weak political or economical stand, but because of the Soviet Union, they had this kind of like the upsurge of nationalism to nationalize the oil industry. And it was a head-on collision with British rule. They imposed heavy sanctions on them, crippled the economy, caused a lot of political turmoil.
It seems like Mossadegh was part of that. Also, I'm glad you put in the context of the Soviet Union, that he was part of that kind of post-World War II wave of nationalist leaders like Nasser in Egypt, who were like try to claw back some independence for the colonial masses.
And ironically, Mossadegh, he was pro-America. He was seeing British as the downfall of an empire and demise, and America as a voice of freedom. And he genuinely believed it.
Well,
what a mistake.
Was it that, he learned the hard way, but
he learned the hard way.
Was it also that his National Front kind of saw that the U.S. might be like a fair ally against
exactly.
the British and French? Okay.
Right. It was definitely an ideological bent toward imperialism, which always proves fatal. And Mossadegh made that fatal mistake, and that mistake basically made him defenseless.
I mean, Mossadegh believed that, like Armand said, that the British were a declining empire, the Americans were a rising one. For decades, or years rather, before he even took power, Iranian nationalists were trying to get a better deal, just a better deal with the British in terms of the oil. What set this off in a lot of ways was Mossadegh saying he's going to open the books of what became British Petroleum, because everybody knew that they were cheating the Iranian government out of massive funds. And then when you go look at Saudi Arabia, he saw that Aramco, the Arab American oil company, was sharing profits at a 50-50 basis with the Saudi government, something that the British were absolutely opposed to doing. So what you had was a situation where the British were trying to get the Americans to either carry out a war or carry out a coup to get rid of Mossadegh, especially after he nationalized the oil industry. And at that time, under the Harry Truman administration, Truman was not going for it. He was afraid that if you did a coup or something like that, it would strengthen the hand of the Soviet Union and their ability to intervene. When Eisenhower came into power in 1953 in the US, and around the same time Winston Churchill became the prime minister, both of them upped the ante. And Eisenhower had the opposite view, that if you don't overthrow this guy, it will strengthen the hands of the communists. So for everybody, the measuring stick was what will strengthen the communists and the Soviet Union and what will weaken them.
Yeah.
The British wanted the coup badly, argued for it, but they couldn't do it on their own. And it was the US who did it. And it wasn't like a one-time thing. It took about a week or several days because it initially failed.
When and where they could have actually defended and defeated the coup, because they had the political momentum, they had the numbers, the Tudeh party, closely affiliated with then Soviet Union. They had a large number of cadre in the officers' corps of the Iranian army. They had a huge working class base, so they could have easily mobilized and defended, but they didn't. They basically stood still.
Arman was referring to the Tudeh party, which was the communist party in Iran, had a fairly large base in the working class and actually was in the officer corps, and in some ways one of the pillars of the Mossadegh government, including even having ministers in there, leaving aside that communists shouldn't be in capitalist governments, but they did. And for that week when the coup initially failed before it succeeded, everybody, including the Americans and the Brits, were wondering why, like, thought there was some kind of big trick happening. Why isn't Tudeh on the streets taking over things? And it turns out what Tudeh's leadership was doing was telegramming the Soviet Union, asking for direction and getting stonewalled. Because at that point, the Soviet Union was in the phase of what you would call peaceful coexistence, which meant that they didn't want to challenge capitalist rule anywhere, and they thought it would be detrimental to their interests to do so. And so they didn't want to upset that balance and basically left Tudeh to hang, and Tudeh did. And Mossadegh was overthrown, and the Shah was reinstalled into power, and then you spoke to the rest. A brutal regime for about a quarter century that just annihilated all forms of opposition. I will say one other thing. The mullahs who took power in 1979 did not cover themselves in glory in 1953. They were a bit split, but the bulk of them were opponents of Mossadegh. The National Front included mullahs, but many actually abandoned it because they never really cared about that stuff too much, and a few actually aided the efforts of the coup. So
they were in the pocket of British.
Yeah.
The British.
There were splits within the mullahs, but yeah.
The ones who went by the coup, they were beefed up by the British.
I was just going to say, one of the things that people listening to this should bear in mind is everything that's Islamic is today painted as pure evil. However, there was a period in time in the not too distant past when the U.S. actively worked with Islamic political forces and Islamic fundamentalists because they thought, and not unjustifiably believed, that they could ally with them against godless communists as well as secular nationalists. And you will find examples like this all over the Middle East and the Far East. Afghanistan in the 80s, Indonesia in 1965. It happens over and over and over again. Throughout the 20th century, actually, most of the time, the U.S. and the Islamic fundamentalists were much more allied than not allied.
They were the U.S.'s freedom fighters, quote unquote.
In Afghanistan, yeah.
Yeah, it should be also highlighted and emphasized that the imperialists create these conditions for backwardness where they had any type of progress in culture, in technology, they keep these societies backwards. So obviously, both the oppressors, internal oppressors, and imperialists benefit directly from backwardness because the imperialists create the conditions for this political Islam to exist. They ferment it, they popularize it. But it's a double-edged sword. You make it strong and then it becomes historically the voice of the Iranian nationalism. Now, war has created this condition where the imperialists are at the losing end of the stick, and Iran is on the winning part because politically, what the imperialists were hoping for was to overthrow the regime.
It's getting stronger. It seems like
It's
obviously
getting stronger. So the Islamic regime is not going to go away.
So we can talk about the Islamic regime. And I also know, Armand, from your history as a Marxist, that you have a lot to say about 1979, particularly the working class aspirations for social liberation, that there was a defeat for the Iranian masses and that workers and women and oppressed minorities were crushed by the clerical caste under Khomeini and the mullahs.
Yeah, absolutely. It's essential. In the mass uprising, in these reactionary mass uprisings that was led by the mosque, their slogan was independence, freedom, Islamic Republic. And the left went along with it. They didn't oppose it. The program of the left was the two-stage revolution. So they didn't want to fight for the proletariats to take power. Instead, they wanted to make popular fronts with the Islamists, with the national bourgeoisie, basically national bourgeoisie to come to power. And then there'll be a period of democracy, then there'll be a socialist revolution. So they actually acted on that. And so that goes against that whole theory that you hear it from everybody, that the mullahs hijacked the revolution. No, the two-stage revolution tailed the mosque, and then when the Shah was overthrown, the state was handed over to the National Front, not the Islamists. Prime Minister Bazargan of National Front became the first prime minister. The national bourgeoisie is so weak politically, they couldn't contain the class struggle. But the left betrayed it at every turn. The left betrayed the struggle of women to defend their democratic rights. The left labeled it as not necessary, as a sidestep that would weaken the anti-imperialist struggle. So the mosque was the main anti-imperialist force, and the left tailed it. So to answer your question, in 1979, the left, instead of mobilizing the independent oil workers and building the party for workers' government, but because of the two-stage revolution, they had no program for the working class to be mobilized independently. And subsequently, it was left defenseless, and that created the condition for defeat of the working class and the strengthening of political Islam.
In my mind, I think you could summarize it. 1979 posed the potential of one of three outcomes, either mass bloodshed and the Shah remaining in power. The other possibility was actually a working class revolution, because it was on the agenda, particularly with the oil workers in the South. And the third option, which is what transpired, was the mullahs coming to power. And I think any revolutionary in Iran at the time, what the program they should have fought for is obviously beginning with opposition to the Shah, but also opposition to the mullahs, and instead fighting for working class power. The problem was that was not the left's program. And the mullahs offered the answer that the left was incapable of offering. And the left, instead of counterposing its own answer, tailed the mullahs. And yeah, the first prime minister was a Mossadegh Arab National Front prime minister, but that was a period of consolidation by the Islamic government. And once they consolidated, they purged their opponents, including by shooting them, whether they be nationalist Mossadegh types or communists, or in some cases, depending on the circumstances, ethnic and national minorities within Iran, like the Kurds.
The mosque is very strong, both in terms of having these actual institutions that provide a solid ground for recruiting, networking, mass gatherings. And also, historically, the strength has been in land, owning a lot of land, gardens, pistachio production. While the national bourgeoisie has been both politically and economically weak. The mosque, on the other hand, it did have the answer to hold the whole state apparatus together in creating a armed force, the Revolutionary Guards. So Revolutionary Guards have their fingers in all of these aspects of society. That's another thing, what the left does. Iranian left more so. They equate this Islamic theocracy rule with imperialism, like they're both equally responsible, or somehow they're equal in politics or and that's just not so.
Yeah.
We'll say that the Islamic regime will be overthrown, but imperialism will still stays intact. The Shah went, imperialism stayed, so imperialist domination precedes your demand to overthrow the Iranian regime.
So I wanted to address next something that a lot of people have been raising, and it actually goes back to our very first episode of this podcast, US or Israel, Who's Daddy? And that's basically the idea that Israel strong-armed the US into this war. Is Israel the dog or the tail? And it came up when Joe Kent, who was the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, he resigned, said that Iran posed no imminent threat to the U.S., and in his resignation letter, he said, quote, "It is clear that we started this war due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby." So basically, you have one side of this idea, the tail wagging the dog theory is basically Israel is in charge. You get this argument from like the MAGA types who are using it to bolster their idea of, America first, not Israel first. You're also getting it from leftists who I think are kind of falling in the trap that the US is this victim of Israeli manipulation. And then I think there's an argument that we've made on this podcast before, which is that the US is still very much in charge and Israel is a very effective tool. And that doesn't deny the fact that the Zionist lobby is very powerful, but we're basically arguing that Israel is not tricking the US. The American imperialists have always wanted a weakened Iran to make sure that there's not a challenge to US hegemony. Some of the reason why this debate frustrates me is because it feels like it comes down to whatever you think is supposed to be the correct US imperialist strategic interest. And I just think there's not one wing of the bourgeoisie. Like they share the same common class interests, but they often have different angles or ways to achieve their goals. So this came up particularly in an interview with John Mearsheimer, who is a very well-respected professor from the University of Chicago. He did an interview with Max Blumenthal on the Gray Zone. I have a lot of respect for both of them. I don't always agree with them, but the background to this clip that we're going to listen to from this interview is that Professor Mearsheimer co-authored a book 20 years ago about the Zionist lobby called The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy. It was very controversial at the time, not so much anymore. And I thought that this clip kind of captured something. Mearsheimer is arguing that U.S. support for Israel is unrealist, meaning it doesn't help U.S. national interests, but that it's only driven by political pressure from the lobby. And that's what he's attributing this current Iran war to, is basically pressure from the Israel lobby. So let's take a listen.
But if you think about it, the argument that Steve and I are making is that our relationship with Israel is not in our strategic interest. Remember, I said before, Israel is an albatross around our neck. That contradicts the basic thesis of my book and my writings more generally on great power politics, and Steve's as well. But it just goes to show you how enormously powerful the lobby is. I mean, just Max and Aaron, just think about the fact that the United States recognizes that if it has a peer competitor in the international system that it should worry about, it's China, right? And this is why Hillary Clinton enunciated in 2011 that we were going to pivot to Asia. China is seen as the most important threat to the United States inside of the national security community. Well, if you look at these various wars that we're fighting in the Middle East, and the first one, of course, was the 12-day war last June, and now you look at this conflict, it is seriously eroding our capability to contain China in East Asia. We're pulling THAADs and Patriots out of South Korea and Japan. This is truly remarkable. We have been shortchanging East Asia. We have been shortchanging our containment policy in East Asia for quite a while now because of Israel. And the situation is now only getting worse. From a strategic point of view, from a realist point of view, which of course is what Steve and I purvey in our writings, this makes no sense at all. So our relationship with Israel is a really cockamamie relationship that is not in the American national interest.
Well, it's so egregious that this guy is actually pro-war against China.
I do want to clarify that he's not. So basically, Mearsheimer, he's known for this realist theory. And so what he's saying, he's not arguing that China should be contained, but he's saying that the ruling class is in agreement entirely with the desire to contain China and that this war is contrary to that. That's what he's saying.
But it's not.
Exactly. And that, yeah, so tell me about that.
Well, it's not contrary to that at many levels. One, China is already involved because it has interests in protecting sovereignty of Iran for energy reasons, for transportation reasons. Iran can have a continuous railroad, if you will, to China, bypassing the whole sea. So China is a factor in all kinds of equations about Iran. You cannot say, oh, this has nothing to do with it. So factually, it's incorrect. And another fact is the control that the imperialists want to exercise over the flow of oil, pretty much like what they did in Venezuela and Cuba, to choke Cuba off the Venezuela oil, to cripple the economy, destroy their power grid, and make imperialists come back to Cuba. So that's the scenario that ideally they wanted to have for Iran. Overthrow the regime, control the flow of oil to what end? To control China. Because China's oil, a great percentage of it is supplied by Iran. And this war is exactly that, is a war against China as well.
There's two levels to this. One is, what is the effect of this argument? And the other one is the argument on its own merits. In terms of the effect of this argument, it very conveniently alibis U.S. imperialism, and it very conveniently alibis specifically the Trump administration, including for those leftists and others who bought the Kool-Aid that somehow Trump was not going to carry out the sort of regime change wars that the neocons of both the Democratic and Republican persuasion are infamous for. So the argument becomes, oh, Israel tricked him into it. I'm sorry, I have very little to say on that because I think it's a pipe dream. I mean, 3 million dead Vietnamese and 2 million dead Koreans and 1 million dead Iraqis would like to have a word with you if you believe that. Then there's the argument on its own merit, and I thought Armand captured it very well. So let's do a thought experiment here. So the U.S. carried out this kidnapping of Maduro in Venezuela. It cut off the oil from Cuba, and it also cut off that oil from China, because China was also buying Venezuelan oil. Now let's play the mind game where it actually worked in Iran, the decapitation of and the murder of the heads of the government and the state. Now let's pretend, let's say the Iranian government was overthrown and a pro-US force came to power, however it came to power, whether it's through the Shah or someone else. That would be a victory for the US, not only in relation to Iran, but in relation to China. You've now cut off China from Venezuelan oil and from Iranian oil. And you've basically left China with nothing but Russian oil.
Yeah.
And then you can turn around and make a deal with Russia. Hey, let's get you out of this Ukraine war. We'll unsanction your oil. We'll unsanction everything. And, all you got to do is throw off China. It's just incredible that someone as intelligent as Mearsheimer would think that China has no connection to this war. And my biggest proof in some ways that China and Russia have connections to this war is that China and Russia are aiding Iran. in this war through intelligence because they understand where they fit in this equation.
I think the main argument is he thinks this is irrational and illogical on the part of the US, and that basically the US is wasting blood and money on a fake threat. But I think the main problem I have with this, whatever angle you have, whether you're a maggot type or, you're a leftist or even some radical leftists who are making this argument, I just feel like it comes down to like, if America could just be freed from Israel, then it would be,
America the good.
Yeah.
There's another side to this. He talks about Israel as an albatross on the US. I would beg to differ. Israel is a powerful regional power. There's no question about that. And I will not dispute the power of the Israel lobby, nor will I dispute the fact that Israel tries to influence the US and in some cases does. We just went through talking about the 1953 coup in Iran against the Mossadegh government, where you could very much argue that Britain very much influenced the US to carry out that coup. In neither case does that mean that either Britain or Israel runs American foreign policy. In fact, Israel is crucial to American foreign policy in the Middle East because it is the linch point for control of the oil flow and of maintaining American hegemony in the Middle East. And that could mean signing peace deals with Egypt and Jordan like they did in the past, or it could mean the so-called Abrahamic Accords like they have now. Or it could mean you just pummel the living daylights out of anybody that doesn't abide by your rules. It does not change the fact that, yes, of course, Israel and the US don't have exactly the same interests. I think the US would have liked to have seen regime change. I think Israel wants to do to Iran what the US and Israel did to Syria, which is just utter destruction and chaos and collapse, and let it break into its constituent parts so that it basically poses no threat to anybody. That is pivotal for American interests in this oil-rich region. And it really matters not one bit that the US produces its own oil and doesn't need the oil of the Middle East for its own internal consumption, because power abhors a vacuum. If the US is not in control of that oil, it means someone else is going to be in control of that oil, which is probably going to be the Chinese right now. And I'll give you one last point on that. The US has basically been driven out of its military bases in the Middle East through the Iranian bombing. God bless Iran. But you know where they cannot be driven out of? The USS Zionist State of Israel. That is a permanent military base stationed in the Middle East. Military bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia can come and go, but that one stays. That's why it's not an albatross.
Just to add to what Ezra said about these American bases being destroyed, it then again proves that Israel is a military outpost for the imperialists that would not possibly exist without the American bombs, without the American dollars, without the American direct aid to that country.
As Joe Biden famously said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent one to protect U.S. interests.
And if the U.S. or the Trump administration allowed itself to be influenced by Israel into this war, if we just take that argument on its face value, that doesn't change anything. You're influenced by those you want to be influenced by. You accept that influence because you share the program of getting rid of the Iranian government and humbling Iran. So this idea that the U.S. is carrying out Israel's war for Israel, no, the U.S. is carrying out a joint war where they are in charge.
I think Trump talked about it in The Art of the Deal.
The thing is, Iran is inside of Iran for anti-war. They see it as an imperialist war against them. They don't see it as Israeli war. They truly see it as an imperialist war.
I want to talk a little bit about the consequences of this. I think everyone has heard Pete Hegseth's asking for another $200 billion because it takes money to kill bad guys. You can't make this up. So we're already seeing gas prices. We're seeing crude hovering around 120 a barrel now. Every dollar that this goes up, everyone's going to see a jump at the gas station. I'd like to say so much for the energy independence narrative that some MAGA types bought into. Food system, not just fuel, but there's hidden petroleum in the food system, like in terms of fertilizer. Interest rates, given the risk of inflation, we probably won't see interest rate cuts. So that means borrowing costs are going to stay high for things like mortgages, credit card debt. Things going to get more expensive. And the people who profit, of course, are the weapons manufacturers, defense companies, Lockheed Martin and Raytheon, and the oil giants who are going to get all their war profits. Everyone is saying this is going to be a full-blown economic crisis. But the way that the media, these loyal stenographers for the ruling class, have been talking about it is there's going to be, for Americans, short-term pain for long-term gain. And Cam found this clip from Fox News, which is just golden, because it's basically like, okay, all you people at the bottom, just be patient. Like, it's not as bad as the OPEC crisis. Like, OPEC crisis was so much worse. So just be glad it's not 1973.
Yeah, she specifically says in this clip, people have a short memory. And I'm like, the people who lived through that are now in their 70s. Like, what are you even talking about, man? It's ridiculous. And it just really speaks to the desperation to support Trump no matter what by the MAGA base. But yeah, just crazy stuff to go with this short-term pain, long-term gain thing is such a joke.
When people see gas prices start to go up, they start to think, how long is this going to go on? How bad could it get?
Yeah, one of the things that you notice when you look at this story is how short people's attention span is for any form of pain, right? And you look back, we talk a lot about the historical perspective, and you brought up with me this morning the issue of 1973 and what that oil embargo was like. And, people waited on lines for 2 hours in the morning. And at that point, the United States had been completely cut off from oil by OPEC. We are in a totally different environment now. We're the most dominant energy producer in the world. So, I think that people just sort of need to take a breath and wait a minute for some of this to shake out.
Take a breath, you babies. There's not even 2-hour gas lines. You guys are wimps.
Suffer more, you fucking Untermenschen. Suffer.
That's exactly what it's like.
Oh, God. So grotesque. So grotesque.
Well, what was the OPEC crisis? The long lines.
It was the crisis in the 1970s when the Gulf states cut off the U.S. from oil in response to
the Yom Kippur War.
Yeah. So I have no idea whether it'll be like as bad as the OPEC crisis. Might not be as bad. Might be worse, but in a different way, in the sense that it might trigger the AI bubble to finally burst. That's what the Financial Times was worried about. So I have no idea how bad or not bad it's going to get, but the starting point for the American populace today is far worse than what it was in the early 1970s in terms
of
condition. People are barely making it before this deranged war was launched, and people are already basically paycheck to paycheck if they can even be that. So when you're in such a precarious position, even minor increases, and I don't think this will be minor, can have profound impacts. But there's also another side to this, which is, as Iran keeps pointing out, the Strait of Hormuz is not closed. It's simply closed to the U.S. and its allies. Other ships are going through just fine, but you have to pay to go through, and you have to pay not in U.S. dollars, but in Chinese currency, in yuan.
I love that. That's such a G move right there.
It is, because I don't know what the long-term impact of it is going to be, but it's a direct challenge to the petrodollar. And if you take the petrodollar out of the equation, economic conditions for the U.S. are going to get a hell of a lot worse, because the American currency is artificially floated throughout the world through the fact that two countries that are not the U.S. are buying oil, one selling, one buying, have to do it in the U.S. dollar. So I don't know what's going to happen. I generally find that economists can't predict a 100-mile-an-hour train when it's 10 feet away from them, but it isn't going to be good the longer this continues.
Even if you're measuring it by the metrics that economists use, which is always a stock market, which has nothing to do with what people's actual economic day-to-day existence is. But even if you were to measure it by the stock market, you're talking about, guess what? The Dow isn't at what Pam Bondi was saying it was a few weeks ago.
It's well below the 50,000 that she was so happy about.
The impact of this war is also global. It's not just how it's impacting negatively America. It's impacting Asia directly. Mm-hmm. There were fuel shortages in Thailand. They were already experiencing long lines. It has exposed the whole food production in terms of its dependency on oil. So all of this has global impacts that this war has exposed, that how interdependent and how fragile this system is. And Iran has not been blind to any of these. They've positioned themselves to fully take advantage of the global supply that has to go through Strait of Hormuz.
That's where their leverage is, yeah.
Right. They've had the upper hand, knowing what the impacts would be on the global economy, on the Gulf region. These UEA and the Saudis and Kuwaitis, that minority of Sunni rulers who oppress their own people, who exploit migrant labor to enrich themselves, they've been all artificially created too. And now it's exposed all of these fallacies, vulnerabilities in the region. And it shows that Iranians, how they picked up targets has been very much calculated.
Notably, they haven't bombed any schools or hospitals.
Exactly. They've shown a lot of restraint in how they respond.
Yeah, just as a small factual point on that, both Saudi Arabia and Jordan are deploying troops to Bahrain to shore up the monarchy there, because it's a Sunni monarchy installed by the British that rules a majority Shia population.
Ironically, one of the first countries that has the potential for regime change is Bahrain. So the impacts of the war has not gone the way that the imperialists have imagined it to be.
Last night when we were preparing for the podcast, we were talking a little bit about the impact and the global repercussions, which we obviously can't predict, but they're going to be bad. And then we were talking a little bit about the worst case scenario being the potential for nuclear war.
Exactly, yeah.
And I think this goes back to like the first part that I was mentioning about what you brought up, Armand, about the Cold War and that period, because during the Cold War, the US and the Soviet Union were enemies. There was an understanding that nuclear weapons were like civilization ending. So
Yeah.
Even in 1947, you had the doomsday clock, and the doomsday clock was set to 7 minutes to midnight. In January of 2026, this is even before the Iran war, scientists set that clock to 85 seconds to midnight, which is the closest that it's ever been to total annihilation. And I don't know how real that is, and I'm not saying like, oh, we judge everything based on the doomsday clock or something like that, but I think the main point is that the US and Israel are playing with fire. And they have proven to be the crazed lunatics in the region that are capable of using nukes, and particularly in terms of Israel, which has the Samson option, which is this standing policy of basically, instead of facing military defeat, Israel will plunge the entire region into nuclear holocaust. How real is this? Like, what do you... This is how we always end on optimism in this show. It's very important.
So U.S. has put in place the doomsday airplane for such an attack. Night Watch, the doomsday plane, has been deployed by Americans to the region that has the nuclear launch codes necessary for the operators of these missiles to receive and launch these missiles. The very fact that the imperialists directly or indirectly hint to it is a testament to the barbarism, to the level of dehumanization, militarism, the tendency of the imperialists toward militarism, genocide, the ongoing wars. And now this threat of nuclear war is taken as, oh, well, that's just a part of it, right?
Yeah, it's really scary. And I think one of the things that makes it even scarier is the atomic bomb is nothing compared to the level of nuclear weapons that exist today. What modern nuclear weapons are like, it makes what happened in Japan seem like small.
The horror that it generates.
When the very courageous and heroic Israeli nuclear scientist Mordechai Vanunu revealed to the world the extent of Israel's nuclear arsenal, something for which he suffered 18 years in prison, most of them in solitary confinement, where I believe his mind is gone. And he's still not allowed to leave Israel to this day, even though he was released from prison. When he issued that release, it was in 1986. And at that time, he said Israel had about 200 nuclear warheads. I see journalists that I very much respect still quote that number of 200. You got to be really dumb to believe Israel only still has 200 nuclear warheads between 1986 and the present. Their nuclear arsenal must be significantly more than that.
So, whether or not you are scared of nuclear war, people are definitely seeing the effects of this. There's been a lot of studies and surveys showing that the majority of the population is against this war and thinks it's futile. They're opposed to ground troops being sent in. But we haven't seen a level of opposition in the same way that we have in previous wars. I haven't seen massive protests in the last few weeks. I think a big part of that might be the economic reality, like that the working class is drowning and their livelihood is at stake and stuff. But I'm also curious about some of the political reasons. I know, Ezra, you and I were talking about some of the possible reasons, like hostility to the Iranian regime, people scared of the repression against protesters over the last period, kind of crushing defeatism. What is your take on why, if there is so much anti-war sentiment, why haven't we seen this manifesting itself in massive demonstrations outpouring against US imperialism?
I think there are 4 overlapping reasons, some of which you mentioned. I think within the American populace, there is still a degree of hostility to the Iranian government, even among people opposed to the war. The second reason is I think the massive repression initially unleashed by Biden, but then intensified under Trump against pro-Palestine protesters, I think that repression has taken a toll. There's fear because to go out against this war on the streets to show your face, it means you're going to go against the holy state of Israel. And you've already seen the repercussions of that. 3, I think there's a widespread feeling in the US that protesting isn't going to do anything, both structurally and in relation to the specific administration. Orange Caligula isn't going to listen to what liberal-minded opponents of the war think. And disgruntled Trump supporters aren't going to protest. So I think people are just trying to get by and are generally afraid mainly for their livelihoods. And fourth, and probably, or perhaps most importantly, the Democrats support the war. Or at the very least, they support its regime change aims, if not the particular bumbling ways this government is doing it. Yeah. It's true that there are Democrats against the war, but no one who is prominent or capable of bringing out large numbers. And I would also say those Democrats who say they oppose the war begin every statement by denouncing the Iranian government, which reinforces the first point, which is you're supposed to hate this government. And so rinse and repeat. Those are, I think, the main reasons why you're not seeing those big protests.
Only thing that I can add is, in case of defeat by the US imperialists, would have consequences. Now, I don't want to predict, but defeat, it creates conditions for more discontent. Because, when the ruling class is weak, when they lose their narrative, especially the political narrative, then these other voices find a platform to emerge. And we should be prepared for that. Having a correct analysis of the present situation, which I think we do in terms of defending the right of Iran to defend itself, the right of Iran to have access to nuclear weapons and the means to carry those out, the right of Iran to develop nuclear energy, nuclear technology, the right of Iran to be a sovereign country. These would weaken the imperialists regionally and globally and at home, that would create conditions for class struggle. In Iran, we would be in favor of independent working class action to assist in war efforts, to defend their factories against imperialist domination. And in America, to actually ask for the defeat of US imperialism, because it's the US imperialists who are exploiting the American workers, the American people. So
exactly.
No matter how it pans out, it will have a profound impact on class struggle and world politics.
I very much agree. And I want to just very explicitly say that it is in the interests of American workers for the American ruling class to be defeated in its vicious war against Iran. The same ruling class that kills little babies and little girls in Iran and civilians and just wants to annihilate that country is the one that is starving you, depressing your wages, not allowing you to raise your family or to have the means to have a decent life. It is not Iran that's doing that. It's not Putin that's doing that. It's not China that's doing that. It is our ruling class. And that's what needs to be defeated. And with that in mind, I'd like to close by giving the last word to Rosa Luxemburg, who wrote this amid the First World War, because I think, even though it was a different situation, it perfectly captures the system of capitalist imperialism that we are living through today. Shamed, dishonored, wading in blood and dripping in filth, thus capitalist society stands, not as we usually see it, playing the roles of peace and righteousness, of order, of philosophy, of ethics, but as a roaring beast, as an orgy of anarchy, as a pestilential breath, devastating culture and humanity. So it appears in all its hideous nakedness.
But we don't love anybody who doesn't love us.
We do appreciate you listening to Unwashed and Unruly. If you hate this, something's probably working. Thank you to our friend Armand for joining us, and make sure to tap that follow button so you remember to listen to our 20th episode.